Well, welcome everyone here on a Sunday. Thank you. Welcome to the Ann Arbor District Library and to this wonderful event. I'd like to ask everyone to make sure that your cell phones are on silent mode or turned off. We do have also hearing assistance devices available just behind you in the entrance if anyone would like to make use of that. There's restrooms and a water fountain just around the corner and to the right. And I wanted to give a quick preview of a related event or series of events, really. It's the Big Gay Read, AADL's September series. The 57 Bus is the book by author Dashka Slater. And there will be an author event at the Downtown Library September 21st at 6 p.m. That's in the lobby. And there's also a discussion for the public coming up this Thursday, actually, at 6:30 at our Westgate location. If anyone's interested in checking that out, it should be great. I would like to introduce this program. So, first of all, thank you so much to Tim and Isabel for being here to speak about their collaboration and for sharing this kind of journey they've been on with us. I like to read their bios, and Isabel Clare Paul, you can see up here, I believe these are the bios in the book, slightly adapted, is a freelance illustrator and lives in Ypsilanti. She earned her BFA in illustration from the College of Creative Studies in 2020. And Tim Retzloff teaches history and LGBTQ studies at Michigan State University and lives in Lansing with his husband, Rick. He received his BA from the University of Michigan in 2006 and his PhD from Yale University in 2014. Please join me in welcoming Isabel and Tim.
So I get to go first, and I'd like to thank Heidi Morse for the kind invitation to have us come speak and talk about our project. And it's also nice to be back at the Ann Arbor District Library. My very first job, starting in junior high, was 10 years at the Flint Public Library, and I also had a side gig here at the Ann Arbor District Library, working in circulation for a couple years in the late 90s. So today we're going to start our talk at Christopher Street in New York, which is the site of the famed Stonewall Inn. And Christopher Street is 614 miles from Woodward Avenue in Detroit. Now there is no Christopher Street in Detroit, so these two streets do not intersect, and yet in 1972, this event called Christopher Street Detroit began that did bring them together, and then in our comic book about the event, it brings them together as well. So based on the publicity that they had, we named our comic book after the publicity on their t-shirt and on their matchbooks and whatever come out in Detroit. And this is the nearly forgotten story of Christopher Street, Detroit, 72. And Heidi introduced Isabel and myself, so here we are. And it also is the 50th anniversary of this event. So Motor City Pride had this event in 1972 as the precursor, as the predecessor. And now 50 years later, there have been Pride events in Michigan every year since, sometimes multiple. And in fact, in recent years, there's kind of this explosion of Pride events, including in Lansing, including in Grosse Pointe. I think this year Allegan had, and Kalamazoo, Grand Rapids. There was a Straits Pride at the Mackinac Straits this year. And it's just kind of been something that has become part of LGBTQ culture. Now, it all kind of goes back to this major event called Stonewall, which was a turning point in what we now understand as LGBTQ activism. So it was kind of this couple nights of disobedience, of uprising, of rioting, where the patrons of a bar called the Stonewall Inn in New York fought back against a routine police raid. And this had a galvanizing effect. It was kind of like the combustion all kind of burst into flames. And there had been some activism prior to that, something called the homophile movement, but this kind of sparked a wave of gay liberation, which was a much more in-your-face, militant, visible kind of manifestation of activism around the country, but also around the world. And it included kind of chapters being formed here in Michigan, including the Detroit Gay Liberation Front, which was founded in January of 1970, which led to the formation of the Gay Liberator and a wave of activism that came around that. I've written about this. There's a feature article that I did in Between the Lines in 2019 that kind of talks about this, and if you're interested in that, you can get a hold of me. As part of this, there was a major spread of gay activism on college campuses and university campuses around the state, including at Grand Valley, Western Michigan, Eastern Michigan, Central Michigan, but crucially here in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan, where activists kind of went head to head with the highest levels of university administration. There was a gay liberation movement at Michigan State University, which formed in April of 1970, and then in later 1971, a chapter of the Gay Liberation Front formed at Wayne State University. Now, this whole idea of pride and celebrating pride and commemorating pride once a year dates itself to June 28, 1970, when some activists decided that it was important to remember the Stonewall riots. And so they held a celebration called Christopher Street Gay Liberation Day in New York. They had a march up Fifth Avenue to Central Park. And to kind of give you a flavor, a sense of what that event was like, I want to play a clip from a short 12-minute documentary called Gay and Pride that an activist named Lily Vincennes created, that's now at the Library of Congress. So you can go online and see all 12 minutes. We're going to see about a minute of it to kind of give us the flavor of what that event was like. And I think I have to maybe...
These are mostly independent organizations all across the country. There's somewhere between 60 and 75 independent groups across the United States, maybe more now because they keep growing up overnight. And this is a unified effort on the part of somewhere between 20 and 30 organizations on the East Coast. There are differences primarily of approach and of tactics. Certain groups, for example, tend to emphasize very militant confrontation tactics. Other groups will emphasize a more educational approach, going out into areas where there are what you might call people who, middle America people who don't know very much about homosexuality. And other groups will emphasize different things. Some groups, most groups in fact, provide some kind of social services for our own people, help for people in need. But this is a minor part of the effort. The major effort today is to change the social institutions that make life difficult for us.
So this event in New York is part of why we even remember Stonewall, but it's important that it wasn't just in New York. There were also events in Los Angeles and in Chicago in 1970, a year after Stonewall. And over the years, more and more cities have come on board to host prides, as I mentioned. Now, the person to get the ball rolling here in Michigan was a woman named Gay Whiteside, who was a leader in the Daughters of Bilitis, a Detroit, the first lesbian-specific Detroit organization, who had read about these prides in other cities and was kind of annoyed that there hadn't been one in Detroit. So she kind of got the ball rolling, and then this organization called the Michigan Gay Confederation was formed in March 1970, specifically to have some commemoration for Pride in Michigan. And this was a statewide confederation. That was kind of a key part of it. So there were people involved from Wayne State, from U of M, from Michigan State, but also Kalamazoo, Battle Creek, all over the state. And the result was this major event called Christopher Street Detroit 72, which was the first statewide LGBTQ Pride event, which consisted of a march down Woodward Avenue with a strong Ann Arbor contingent, I'll note. It was led by 1964 Ford Galaxy with 4 drag queens riding on the hood. It culminated in a rally at Kennedy Square in downtown Detroit. And this is Susan Swope, who was the only lesbian speaker at the rally. And I want us to kind of hear her impressions. I think if I do that, no, I have to do this. Maybe. There it is. All right.
I remember when we were planning this march, I delivered a speech. And I remember as I was anticipating giving this speech, thinking, this speech could be on TV. And Michael's parents could see me on TV. And that's how Michael's parents would find out that I'm a lesbian. But I thought, I just have to do it. It's important. And if that happens, it happens. And I remember standing up there and delivering that speech and being really nervous. But, of course, in the event, what got on TV was the drag queens. That's who always gets on TV when you have a gay march.
And in the evening, there was a dance at the Unitarian Church on Cass Avenue, and then the next day there was a major picnic in Palmer Park. So I knew about this. I knew that this was coming up, that the 50th anniversary of this. I also knew that most people did not know that there was a Pride in Michigan in 1972. So the question was how to commemorate, how to tell the story. And I, as a historian, I've been involved in lots of ways of telling stories. And I had, I'd known about this for many years from oral history interviews that I'd done, from various press clippings, from a diary of someone that I interviewed. So that kind of, I knew that there was enough to tell the story in some of its richness, but I didn't know how to tell the story. It was also in the midst of the lockdown. So we're kind of, my husband and I are at home in the midst of COVID. So I started thinking, okay, how do we do this? So the next piece of the puzzle is that in 2015, I went to the first student show of my friend Isabel's first year at the College of Creative Studies, and saw her work. And I'd never seen her work, and was just like blown away that, this person that I've known since she was born, sorry about that, I always, had this amazing talent. And as is shown in a photo of Isabel and her friend Sydney from the 2018 Motor City Pride March in Detroit that was posted on MLive, Isabel had grown to be a wondrous goth lesbian. So kind of the perfect person to approach. So I thought, well, what about doing a comic, some kind of comic? And initially it was like, our vision of this was smaller scale. But first I wanted to know if she would be interested and see if she, how she would translate, the visual images that we had. So I sent her some photos, one of which was this photo of the East Lansing Gay Liberation Chorus performing at the Kennedy Square Pride March. And lo and behold, this is how she interpreted it. And she just kind of captured the energy, she captured the moment in just such an amazing, beautiful way. And then I also sent her a picture of Ken Dudley, who was one of the speakers. And this kind of shows kind of her progression of taking the photo and sketching it out and then coming up with a final version. And initially we thought, okay, we'll see if Between the Lines or some other of these smaller local papers would do 4 or 5 pages. And we would, have this comic strip that would be in Pride. But then we started doing the script, and there was just a lot of material. And we came to think that maybe 4 or 5 pages wasn't enough. It'll also be very transient. People don't keep newspapers. And I did some investigating to see, what it would cost to do a comic book, a standalone, and it just kind of seemed right. And for those of you know, it kind of took on the air of, Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland, one of these old MGM musicals. Let's put on a show. And so it was at this point that I inundated Isabel with scads of photographs that we had.
Yes, you did. So these are some of the examples, a couple of the iconic pictures that we were like, for sure these need to be included in the comic book. And one of the things that really stuck out to us, especially when we were, just sketching and thinking and starting this project, was that all of these people were in their early 20s when this was happening, and now, if they're still alive, they would be older people, and that their memories of this event versus the first direct source that we had of this event were going to be slightly different, because memory changes over time. You remember certain things, you forget certain things. But one thing we definitely wanted to capture was, this point in time in the 70s, what Detroit was like and what being gay was like at that point, versus what it has changed and become now. And so we wanted to ensure that there were going to be, their memories and their stories from when they were younger, but then also from when they were older. And so this is Jim Toy. He was a very important activist in Michigan, but especially in Ann Arbor. And so his portrait when he was younger and his portrait when he was older. This is Susan Swope. We heard her speak earlier in our little clip. And the same thing, her when she was there speaking at the rally versus her what she looks like today. And so same thing, here's a little bit more of my sketching and ideation and that sort of thing. One of the first investments for the project were these colored pencils, because it really was a diverse crowd, and we wanted to ensure that it was going to get across that it wasn't just a bunch of white people leading the movement, because there were a lot of Black people, there were a lot of Asian people, and we wanted to ensure that it was going to be inclusive and accurate to what actually happened. But at the same time, a lot of the photos that I had to work off as references were black and white or sepia toned, which was just, that's how photos were in the 70s. But I knew that the 70s definitely have a very distinctive color palette with lots of browns and oranges and purples and teals. And it was like, there's this very, there's a specific color palette that people think of when they think of the 70s. And I just wanted to capture that to also make sure it got across that this, things happened in the past, but we want the story to feel alive. So this is another example of my work. I traditionally, by myself, I only do black and white. Tim insisted we have color, and that was the right move, but so there's my black and white ink work, and then we had color pencils because it also kind of brought like a nostalgic sort of feel, a scratchy, rough sort of feel, and it really matched the vision and the aesthetic we were going for. And so this is my thumbnail of the first page. sort of like initial thoughts, just getting something down on the page. And I would send it to Tim. And Tim would say, you have to fix this and change this and change this. And then I would do a bigger sketch. And with those refinements and that sort of thing and laying everything out. But on the first page of the comic is Kennedy Square. And I had spent 4 years living in Detroit by myself, going to school, being in that community. But the Detroit that I knew was not the Detroit that is in the 70s. They were very different cities. And so Kennedy Square doesn't exist anymore. It's a Starbucks by Campus Martius. And so I had to recreate this place that I've never been to and kind of find this middle ground between what Detroit was and what I know Detroit to be, and still capture that essence of Michigan, that essence of Detroit, you know, the bootstraps, you know, I have fun. And if nobody's gonna do this, we have to do it. And so here's what the final image turned out to be. And then here's the whole front page in all its glory. And there were definitely a lot of landmarks if you're familiar with Detroit, if you're familiar with Ann Arbor, if you're familiar with Wayne State. There's a couple places in the comic where you're gonna recognize, you know, oh, that's Beaumont Tower. Oh, it's that house. This is the first gay community center in Detroit. It's on Virginia Park, and if you're familiar, Virginia Park is one of the only streets in Detroit that is paved with brick. And so because it was locked down, couldn't go anywhere, I was really working off of Google Street View for a lot of these architectural bases. Like, I was using what I had. And I was really struck by the brick streets because I didn't realize there were brick streets in Detroit. And so we wanted to capture the house. We wanted to make sure that, you know, these features were getting maintained and preserved and that it was gonna be part of the story, whether you realize it or not. But then as we were interviewing people and talking to people, I think it was Mara Lee who insisted, but I was really struck by the car in the street. I was like, that's cute, you know, it's Detroit, it's Motor City, we've gotta have a car in there somewhere. And she said, all the lesbians drove VW Beetles, and so we had to throw in the VW Beetle on the brick road. And it was just things like that that really made this project a lot of fun and really, you know, rewarding for me, because going into it, I didn't know this history. It's the nearly forgotten story, and being, you know, in my young 20s, it was really interesting to connect with the, you know, they were young 20s while they were doing this. They were, you know, my generation in the 70s versus today, and it was kind of intergenerational melange of strange history and learning new stories. But here's some more sketches for, you know, the next couple pages. And we realized that there were some motifs that we were gonna have to keep. And so another thing, especially, not everybody smokes these days, but in the 70s, they did. And so they had matchbooks made for, you know, lighting your cigarette. And it had all the information about the Pride events, and it was gonna be fun, and they had buttons, and it was like, this was just, I thought it was so sweet, I thought it was so interesting, and so we definitely wanted to include that as well in the comic, so here they are, preserved. And then, you know, I mentioned that, you know, people's memories change, different reports say different things. This is a picture of the crowd, but then you go in and you're like, okay, this is a different amount. This is another different amount. And so we had a couple direct sources that said, you know, there were 500 people, and there were 300 people, or there were only 150 people. It was like the amount didn't matter necessarily, because there was still a crowd that came out to be gay and be proud and be loud and take up space and make people recognize that, you know, in the 70s, we're here, you're gonna have to pay attention to us. And so this was one of Tim's ideas, where it's like zooming in or zooming out on the crowd to kind of encapsulate that idea of, you know, the precise numbers don't necessarily matter, that the spirit of the thing was far more important at the time. And then this is one of the centerfolds, and at the shoes at the top, one of my ideas that I really was like, we're gonna do this, was the idea that it was a march. People were there to protest, and so but there were drag queens showing up in heels, and there were butch lesbians showing up in their combat boots, and normal people, like just people showing up in their trainers and their sneakers and flip-flops, and it's like, I thought that was such an interesting way to show the diversity of the crowd, was like, what kind of shoes were they wearing to protest, to march in, to make themselves known? And so we definitely included that, and that's kind of a theme, is like feet and shoes, getting like marching and walking. That idea is definitely common throughout the whole book. And so then I did have a lot of photos of this event, and I remember when Tim sent them to me, he said, "Don't show these to anybody else. We don't have the copyright for that." And so I had this treasure trove of old photos, and I definitely wanted to try and include as many of them as I could without getting in copyright trouble. And so here's one example that I really liked, and then getting it translated into another image. And as the project was going on, we knew of this thing called a cranky, and we knew that the lesbians had it to tell stories and kind of act out like a little mini play. And I had no idea what this thing looked like. I had absolutely no idea how I was going to illustrate this thing. All I had was written texts of what it looked like. And I thought this was really interesting. And as a lesbian, and this is my history, I really wanted to do it right. And so I had to do a little bit of my own research, and I found this cover from the Gay Liberator that's the cranky. It's a big piece of butcher paper that they had illustrated a story, and one woman would be up there cranking it, thus the name Cranky, and the pages would go by, and there would be guerrilla theater acting out the story as it was happening. And I thought this was such an interesting concept. I'd never heard of this. I had no idea about it, and I was like, this is something that's really important to me that I want to be sure gets included. And so here it is. And this was really a kind of a prideful moment for me, where it was like, I did something useful. I found out something Tim didn't know already. But again, it's like the whole project was such a grassroots, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Nobody else is going to make a fuss about this if we don't. No one's going to draw attention to this if we don't. And so they had screen printed all of their shirts. This goes back to the matchbooks and the buttons, everything they did by hand. And so our iconography kind of came from this t-shirt, the butterfly with the power fist raised in the middle for solidarity. And it was just such a lovely thing. And again, it's like, these are the things that we wanted to preserve, and these are the stories that we wanted to make sure we're getting told. And so here's a picture of the lesbian Susan Swopes over in the corner. You can see her with her hand raised. Marilee Melvin in the fun hat in the middle in the bottom row is another source that we talked to. And it was just like, the energy was so nice, and it was so, we're the ones that are going to start this. And it was just so important to me that this got translated nicely, and you could see that, these were real people, and it wasn't just a page in a history book that, you kind of glance over and go, oh, yep, that's a name. They were people. They had lives. They were affected. It's like all of their work led to what we have today, which is a more accepting society, even if there are still problems. And so here's a lovely photo of Susan with the original t-shirt, which is now on exhibit at the Detroit Historical Society Museum. We have a little exhibit downstairs. If you're in Detroit, go check it out. And then I'm going to hand it over back to Tim now.
And I think today's the last day
Yeah.
to get to Detroit to see the exhibit. But she has donated her T-shirt to the Detroit Historical Museum. So
You should have gone sooner.
So once we thought we'd do a comic book, I think we went from 20 to 24 to 28, and then we kind of thought, well, we can't really afford to go further than that.
Mm-hmm.
But we kind of got estimates of what it would be. So the real challenge was, how to pay for this. We thought it was manageable. It was something we could do.
Mm-hmm.
So early on, last summer, while we're in the midst of scripting and then meeting on Zoom once a week and keeping pace and getting the product done in parlance, we wanted to get some support. And from my research and my work as a historian, I had developed relationships with all the major archives, and we wanted them to be part of this, but we also solicited kind of their support. And early on, we got support from the Labadie Collection at the University of Michigan, the Bentley Library at the University of Michigan, Special Collections at Michigan State, the Ruther Library at Wayne State, and then the Detroit Historical Museum. So we kind of got our initial seed money for that. My thought all along was, okay, if we just get a draft of this, a camera-ready draft of this, I want to make sure that Isabel gets paid, and maybe I get paid. So, and they all agreed to kind of lend some initial support. We also had a Gofundme campaign in October where we aimed to raise $6,000. We ended up raising $7,000. And then we went for kind of the big pot of gold, which is the Michigan Humanities has these grants every year for $15,000, which would cover the cost of printing or much of the cost of printing. And they have an arrangement where you have to have matching funds. So the GoFundMe, the support from the various archives and institutions, and some private donors would kind of meet that, as well as some in-kind donations. So Isabel kept pace, and we came up with the kind of final version of it that was ready to go to the printer pretty much the end of October when we first did an advanced proof to kind of make sure.
See what needed to get tweaked.
Right, right. And so, so we went from kind of having this event, having the documentation that we had of this event, to the sketches, the early sketches, to kind of having a finished comic book that we could share with people. And our aim all along was that it would be free, that it was kind of in the spirit of the original event that we were depicting, that we wanted it to be free, and the funding we were seeking was to kind of make that possible. And so we finally went to press in April and had them back in time for Free Comic Book Day. So, you
Soft
know,
launch.
part of the joy was kind of having this expression of queer history for an audience that doesn't usually maybe access history at all, let alone queer history. And then Isabel had a table at Motor City Comic Con again. You know, not the usual place that these stories get told. And so, you know, the rollout came in June. So we had a booth at Motor City Pride, and we had people coming up to us, giving out free comics, and it was just an incredible moment to kind of actually have one-on-one interactions with people. And then as part of the Detroit Historical Museum's contribution and Michigan State's contribution, the museum staged an exhibit that showed enlarged versions of the comic, but also kind of our commentary, like a running commentary track if it were a Blu-ray version of the comic. But also Susan's t-shirt was on display, as well as the Gay Liberation Front banner that Jim Toy kept all of these years, and it was kindly loaned to us by the estate of Jim Toy. And then Michigan State also had an exhibit on display. So it was, as I said, it was very much let's put on a show, and it's just kind of amazing to me that we were able to put on this show.
We definitely put on a show.
We put on a show. And so kind of to close out, I do want to kind of go back to kind of this idea that we were very conscious all along the way that we were sharing a story that dealt with real people, and that many of the individuals that are in the comic, you know, were quoted, but there are also people whose names are not in the comic, but we knew that they were there. In some instances, we knew who they were. In some instances, we're still finding out who they were. And I kind of want to zero in on one of the people. So I mentioned that that the march, the parade, the procession down Woodward, one lane of Woodward, was led by these four drag queens on the hood of the Ford Galaxy. They had been, one of them was the winner of the Miss Capital City pageant which was part of Michigan State's gay liberation movement event for that week. So they had a pageant at Joe Cavello's bar in Lansing, and the winner of that was a performer named Aretha. So for a while, that's what we knew. It was Aretha, and we knew that she was on the hood of the car. When it started to drizzle a bit, she was inside the car, and she did a performance to the rally, so she sang at the rally. So she was kind of this crucial part of this pioneering event that we knew next to nothing about. She wasn't.
She was there like every step of the way, and we didn't know anything about her really, besides she was there.
Exactly. So, and along the way, we're kind of, well, she's doing her amazing crafting and conveying and bringing to life the illustrations. I'm kind of, okay, what else can I find? And maybe there's more photos out there, maybe there's more people out there. And I found this article that appeared in July of '72 in the Lansing State Journal that references this pageant at Joe Cavello's as kind of part of the seedy sexual nightlife of Lansing. And so, and then there's this reference to, and the winner was this 6-foot, 200-pound drag queen who worked at a local restaurant. So I've just become fixated on finding out who Aretha was. Now, the Detroit News, from which the rally photo of her singing is from, noted that Aretha's name was Mike Scott. I'm sorry. Scott, thank you, Mike Scott. So I had a name, but I had a common name. And one of my first ventures out after being vaccinated was to the Capital Area District Library, where I went through some city directories, found Mike Scott, who worked actually by that point was working in the cafeteria at Michigan State. So over time, I kind of used Ancestry.com and found out bits and pieces more about Mike Scott, to the point of finding out that he was a graduate of high school, at Central High School in Kalamazoo, that he had died in 2010 at age 63. And then I ordered his death certificate, because there's like, okay, hopefully there might be some information there. And the death certificate had kind of a key piece of information, which was the informant was his sister. His sister was a person named Karima Hassan. Turned out she lived not far from where we live in Lansing, was still alive, 78. And so I wrote her a letter, not sure how she would react. I was very careful with what I wrote in the letter. And then 3 days later, she calls me up, and she was just so thrilled that someone wanted to remember her brother. And then in June, I finally got to meet her, and she has this photo of Michael and Michael's friends. And he continued to perform in Lansing all through his later years. And so, you know, in addition to kind of presenting this story and kind of bringing it into the world, I'm just thrilled that some of these aspects of our history that wouldn't ordinarily be known now get to be known. So, and so now we can do some Q&A.
Yeah.